Hi, this is the third video in our series of the role of organisms in the flow of energy and the matter cycling within ecosystems. So specifically, in objective 3, we're going to be talking about cellular respiration, which is the process that most of the life forms on the planet use to obtain useful energy that to power up the activities that they have to do in their bodies. Now, notice that both plants and animals do this process, and we're going to be talking more about that in detail. So this is the formula for cellular respiration right here. And you will notice that it's a process that requires sugar, which comes from the digestive system. Organisms of different kinds have different ways to digest their food and break it down so that you get that sugar. And then that sugar gets transferred through the circulatory system all throughout the body, through every single cell they have, in order to actually produce energy with it. In order to do that, you also need oxygen, which is why a lot of organisms have breathing systems, whether it's a network of tubes like bugs have to distribute their gases around, or getting it straight through diffusion from the water, or if they get it from their gills or lungs. Depending on the organism, there's a breathing system, but the goal is capturing oxygen to deliver that oxygen, and once again, through the circulatory system to all the cells of the body so that the organism can use the oxygen inside of specialized structures called mitochondria to break down the glucose a lot and produce a lot of the useful energy, which is the goal of this whole process. In the result, it also produces carbon dioxide, which is what the glucose becomes. So like all the food that we eat actually breaks down into carbon dioxide, which we breathe out. So we eat food and breathe it out in the form of carbon dioxide. And we also, of course, trap the energy that's produced during that process. But a lot of people have the misconception that the carbon dioxide comes from the oxygen, and it's not exactly true. The oxygen actually becomes water, which we end up peeing out of our bodies or sweating out of our bodies. So glucose goes to carbon dioxide, oxygen goes to water, but oxygen and carbon dioxide are waste products because the whole point of this is making that energy. Here's the same equation again, except this time with chemical formulas. You see the sugar is also C6H12O6. Then you need one of those and 6 molecules of oxygen in order to produce carbon dioxide, 6 of those, and 6 molecules of water and a ton of ATP. The ones on the left side are called reactants, the ones on the right side are called products. You do need to know these things because a lot of the questions in the test are going to be asking you about what is it required and what is necessary, what comes out as a waste or what comes out of the process and what is the point of it. So this first minutes of this video are what most of the questions of the test are actually going to be focusing on. And we're going to be talking more about that on objective 4 when we compare cellular respiration and photosynthesis, and you're going to see that they're actually the opposite of each other. So once again, there's a misconception that carbon dioxide that we breathe out is coming from the oxygen that we breathe in. Just like there's a misconception in the photosynthesis that the oxygen that plants produce come from carbon dioxide. In fact, what happens to the oxygen that we breathe in is it becomes water. And the carbon dioxide actually comes from the breakdown of the glucose in order to form the chemical energy that we actually need. Now, all of this actually happens inside of the mitochondria, and it's in the final stages of cellular respiration that the oxygen is actually necessary. So it's only in the mitochondria that the oxygen is necessary. There are steps of cellular respiration that happens outside of that. We'll talk more about that in a second, but first I want to mention that this mitochondria, just like the chloroplast we talked about in the plants, it's another one of these endosymbiotic life forms that technically lives inside of every single thing on Earth that can do aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration means a respiration using oxygen. Mitochondria is like a descendant of an ancient aerobic bacteria that evolved to capture oxygen from the atmosphere and use that to break down sugar in a very efficient way to make a ton of energy. And early on, a cell must have enveloped that, but instead of killing it, lived symbiotically with it, protecting it, giving it nutrients, giving the sugar, and in return, getting the advantage of doing this amazing process that produces a ton more energy than it would without it. So all of the protists, which are unicellular eukaryotic organisms like amoeba and paramecium, and fungus, and yeast, and plants, and animals, and algae, every single life form on Earth that has an endosymbiont called mitochondria, all of the eukaryotic life forms that have nucleuses, they all have it. So it must have happened very, very early on in the history of life. Now, do you still find mitochondria outside cells? Not exactly. They depend on cells. So it's kind of hard to argue that they're alive, but they're alive just within cells, trapped within it. But there are cousins of mitochondria, aerobic bacteria living all over the planet still. And that's how we know and we think that that's exactly how it happened a long, long, long time ago. Now, the mitochondria's role is to perform what's called aerobic respiration, which is a process that produces a ton more energy than you would without it. And in cells, you don't find just one. You find hundreds of these because they are the powerhouse of the cell. Their goal is to break down organic molecules like sugar to make cellular energy in the form of ATP, which is a useful type of chemical energy that can actually be used for the cells on the fly to do all the chemical reactions that it needs to do. So the reason you're going to have hundreds of these is because there's a lot of things the cells want to do. And of course, as a byproduct, you produce also carbon dioxide, which is considered a waste product and that has to leave the cell. Now, at the very end of the process of cellular respiration inside the mitochondria, it uses oxygen to make water. And so that's why oxygen is very, very important, because it can only do its job if it has it. Now, if you notice on the diagrams, outside the mitochondria, you can only make 2 miserable ATP with a process called glycolysis, which 99.9999% of life on Earth does. I don't know if this number is exactly right, but it's almost everybody. Everybody almost on Earth has the capacity of breaking down sugar to make a little bit of energy. But the life forms that can do aerobic respiration, like aerobic bacteria, or all the life forms that have mitochondria inside, can actually produce way more energy through a series of other processes that produce a ton more of ATP, up to 36 more, depending on circumstances. I think it's 34 total, actually. So you have the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. And remember, at the end of the transport chain is when you use that oxygen. So you need it in order to do this magical, efficient process that mitochondria can do. The other thing I want to talk about is this misconception that plants don't do this, right? Oh, plants do photosynthesis. That's not true. They do photosynthesis, but they also do cellular respiration. They also need the same type of chemical energy in the form of ATP, which is made, a lot of it is made through cellular respiration. Does photosynthesis make some ATP? Absolutely. Can plants live off of it? No. It's not enough ATP. And even if it was, what would they do in the times of darkness? What do they do during the winter time when the sun is not out as much? What would they do during times where there's not enough water to power, which is one of the requirements for photosynthesis, and it's too dry? What would they do in times that they don't have access to as much carbon dioxide, if that's the case, right? So they have to be prepared for those eventualities. So what plants do is that when they have what they need, they do a ton of extra photosynthesis to store a ton of extra sugar and make a ton of extra food. That's very good for the ecosystem. We'll talk about that in a second. But then afterwards, in times of darkness, in times of not enough water, in times of wintertime, when they don't have leaves, whatever the reason may be, that they can't do photosynthesis, just like you and me, they're going to break down that sugar in order to create energy. In fact, even during the day, they're doing that. The difference between plants and other organisms, or algae / plants and other organisms, is not that they don't do cellular respiration, is that they don't need to eat to do cellular respiration. Organisms need to acquire food, usually, unless they make their own. So the difference is that photosynthesis is the process of making your own food, while cellular respiration is the process of breaking that food down to make energy. And plants do that as well. So during the day, they will be doing a ton of photosynthesis, way more photosynthesis than they do cellular respiration. And then during the night, they will do just cellular respiration. But during the day, they do have cellular respiration as well, because they're trying to break down the food that they made earlier into energy. Now, I told you that this is good for ecosystems. Why? Because they do a ton more photosynthesis than cellular respiration during the day, what ends up happening is that they store way more sugar than they need. And that provides food for the entire food web to exist. Also, they also trap carbon dioxide, which takes carbon dioxide away from the atmosphere, making things a little less warm than they would be otherwise, and produce oxygen. Now, they also consume oxygen because they do cellular respiration, remember. But because they do a ton more photosynthesis than cellular respiration, they end up producing more oxygen than carbon dioxide. And so that means that the net effect is that we have an atmosphere full of oxygen nowadays, because over the history of life, a ton of carbon dioxide has been constantly converted to oxygen. Not exactly, but remember, carbon dioxide becomes sugar and water turns into oxygen. But the net effect is that more oxygen is made than carbon dioxide through the plants because they make more sugar than they need. Another thought that is important for this test is this idea that different parts of the body must work together to get this job done. The cellular respiration actually happens inside of cells, where they break down the actual sugar to make the energy that cells need to do their job. Every cell needs to do this. Almost invariably throughout the body, cells need it. Some cells need more than others. So you're going to find way more mitochondria inside of muscle cells or brain cells that actually spend a lot of energy. Less inside something like blood cells, which just transport things from one place to the other, like the red blood cells. But almost every cell, in order to stay alive, needs to produce energy. So every cell needs sugar, right? So that's where the digestive system will break down the food from larger molecules, such as glycogen and starch, starch is how plants store sugar, and it's like chains. And the glycogen, since it has even more chains, providing even more places for the sugar to be broken down when needed, especially since animals need energy faster than plants do. So it's more branched. But either way, these energy storage molecules are too big to be transferred through the blood. And so you need digestive enzymes in the stomach, in the intestines, in your saliva to break down the food into smaller chunks that the blood, the circulatory system, can actually pick up from the intestines and deliver to every single cell of your body, where the cellular respiration actually happens by breaking down that glucose. The same kind of thing happens with the air, right? So your lungs will capture oxygen from the air, transfer that into the blood, which will transfer the oxygen through all your cells and then into the mitochondria to use that to actually do the magic that we just talked about. The chemistry that powers all the life forms, all the cells in your body. Then the mitochondria produces carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide will get out of your body and through the blood, back to the lungs and out. Now remember, the carbon dioxide actually comes from the breakdown of the glucose, and the oxygen ends up in water. But the net effect is that oxygen is going to come in and carbon dioxide is going to come out through the lungs. It's just that you're technically breathing out the food you ate, and you technically pee out the water you drank. So that's kind of like, or the water you actually made, actually. Because you drink water also because you don't make enough water for cellular respiration to keep yourself hydrated. You need to actually drink some too. But the water you make is coming from the oxygen that you breathe in. Now, some organisms, they live off of eating a lot of grass, right? All the herbivores in the planet. And these guys have to digest a special type of sugar molecule called cellulose, which is another type of plant sugar that plants use for structural purposes. They build strong barks of trees, which is why paper has that toughness to it when you try to rip it or stretch it. That's cellulose. That's the fiber that's inside of that paper. Now, organisms that eat primarily green food will have to learn how to break that down as well, except that you'd be surprised to find out that most of them can't. They cannot digest the cellulose. And so how can they survive on it? They have internal bacteria living inside of the digestion tracts that actually have the ability to do that, and they live symbiotically with them, right? So the bacteria live inside of their digestive tracts, and that's how they broke it down. We don't necessarily have that as humans. We have some, but not many. And so what we end up doing is having to eat sugar from other sources like starch or glycogen in order to get our energy. Now, so we eat foods which are not so green. They're more starchy, right? They're more, or meat that has glycogen inside. Now, remember that these organisms survive only with the help of this symbiotic bacteria. If you do end up eating way more sugar than you need, the body will take that extra sugar and store as fat, which is a molecule that has large chains of carbons and hydrogen attached to each other, and store a lot of energy that way. And if the body ever needs to go back to that energy, they can break down this into other compounds, which ultimately feed back into the mitochondria for energy in cellular respiration as well. But that's what we do every time we eat extra sugar. It's important to note, though, that even though we don't actually digest the cellulose, us humans, we still need that kind of fiber to help our food move in our intestines efficiently. So it does have a role in us, and we are definitely evolved to eat greens as well as other food sources that have starch, glycogen, and protein directly. We even need fat in our diet as well, even though we produce our own fat when we have extra sugar. The fat is not, we don't need it to store fat. The fat that we store comes from our own processes of extra sugar turning into fat. but we do need the fat in order to absorb proteins efficiently, in order to also have our digestive system work the way it's supposed to. One last thought I want to talk about before ending this video, though, is this idea that cellular respiration must be a very ancient process. Early on in the history of life, life was confined to volcanic vents in the bottom of oceans, where the heat of volcanoes was the source of energy that powered the chemical processes of life. Early life forms evolved to use chemicals also from those volcanoes as the source of energy in the chemical processes that drive them. So you have extremophiles that live in those environments. You have things like halophiles that live in really salty places, and acidophiles that live in really acidic places. And even to this day, you go to places like Yellowstone Park at the bottom of the ocean near mid-ocean ridges where they have all this volcanoes erupting, you will see a lot of these life forms that are cousins from these original life forms that Earth started from, life on Earth started from. But this is very limiting because the amount of energy you can get this way, the amount of chemicals you can work on are limited. And the range of where you can live on Earth is also limited. So very early on, life forms must have evolved a way to transfer and store energy in organic molecules which are more complex, like sugar, in order to have food for later if they need it or did not have access to the chemicals that will be coming out of these volcanoes. And as soon as you have sugar around, you're also going to have the need to break it down. So one of the very earliest processes that all life forms that don't live in these places share in common is going to be the ability to break down sugar. But even the life forms that do live in these places, because they tend to store energy in sugar, they will also have the ability to break down sugar. So the ability to break down sugar and do cellular respiration is essentially a universal process in life. That's like glycolysis, that first stage of breaking down sugar. But it makes very few molecules of energy. It only makes 2 ATP. And so it wasn't until aerobic respiration would evolve much later that life was allowed to really explode in its potential. I do also want to mention that the word respiration sometimes is associated with the idea of breathing, right? Respiratory system. But breathing is separate from respiration. Everything on the world can do cellular respiration if it doesn't breathe, like plants, like bacteria, right? So cellular respiration refers to what's happening inside of cells. Yes, us humans and a lot of animals all over the world need to breathe in order to do that. But cellular respiration is the same as breathing, right? Anyhow, after you have life forms with the ability of breaking down simple sugars to make that miserable amount of 2 energies, we're calling glycolysis, life forms evolved to do that magical process of photosynthesis to capture carbon dioxide that was coming from these volcanoes, from other chemical processes that were already happening, and use the sunlight to break down, to capture that carbon dioxide into sugar. Now, you no longer have to be confined near to volcanic vents, near the sources of heat and other types of chemicals. You can actually go anywhere on the Earth where carbon dioxide is around and the sun is around. And that opens the possibilities of life to spread all over the planet. And you also put oxygen in the atmosphere. And so after that, a process that uses that oxygen to more efficiently break down sugar, that's called aerobic respiration, which is what happens inside aerobic bacteria and its cousins, mitochondria, living inside of all of eukaryotic cells that have nucleuses and internal organelles. Now you have the ability to produce 34 ATP instead of just miserable 2. And that causes an explosion of life all over the planet, with a variety of life that is immeasurable compared to what happened before, because now there's tons of energy available, and with a lot of energy, life can do a lot with it. And so either way you look at it, though, cellular respiration is a very, very ancient process. Even aerobic respiration. Aerobic must have gone after photosynthesis, but even before photosynthesis, you have that early ability to break down sugar, because that is crucial to use sugar as a storage of energy, which must have been important so that they don't have to, be dependent on the chemicals coming out of the volcanoes in order to survive. So that means that the cellular respiration is a very important process for the history of life, and that's why most of life forms on Earth have it, because it must have evolved very, very, very early on. On the next video, I'm going to talk about the difference between cellular respiration and photosynthesis, and focus on how they are really 2 sides of the same coin and the central chemical processes of life.